My sourdough routine starts the day before I want to make my dough, and this is when I take my starter out of the fridge. It lives in the fridge all the other days, and I feed it. And this is so that by tomorrow morning when I start making my dough, the starter will be nice and ripe and active. And starter and sourdough is what you use to rise your bread instead of a commercial yeast that you would normally use when making any kind of yeasted dough. The starter is full of wild yeast and bacteria, and you help that yeast and bacteria develop in the jar by feeding your starter, and you can feed it on all kinds of different schedules. I usually feed it once or twice a week right before making my bread, and I usually don't make bread more than twice a week. You can make your own starter, which is very easy but just takes some time and patience. You can also get some starter from a friend or someone you know that makes sourdough bread. That I think is the best way, because any sourdough baker always has extra sourdough starter because you constantly need to be discarding some of your starter. And if you borrow from a friend, that starter is already established and you don't have to wait for it to develop. You can also buy starter from a bakery, or some places online sell it. The flour brand King Arthur sells a starter, and you can get all kinds of different starters on Etsy and things like that, and I'll link some of them below. To make sourdough starter, you simply mix flour and water and let them ferment, and then you have to feed the starter to introduce new food to the yeast and bacteria that develops. And this is basically where I'm beginning this video. The very first thing you do when feeding a starter is discard some of the starter. I know that might sound weird or wasteful or unnecessary, but it will make sense in a second. If you never discard your starter, the volume of it in your jar will keep growing and growing, and that will keep requiring more and more food or flour. So you'll have this never-ending huge starter, and that's the reason that we discard it, because we only need a tiny little bit to remain in the jar in order to feed it and in order for it to get active. So I have my scale here, and a scale is pretty necessary for any kind of baking, bread baking. It's super useful, super easy to use. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn on my scale, and I set it to grams. For my sourdough starter, I like to keep 110 grams remaining in the jar. Different people keep different amounts in their jars. I used to do it where it was only 30 grams of starter remaining in the jar, and that worked for a while, and that used way less flour for feedings. But I found that that starter didn't remain healthy for as long, and I find that if you have a bigger amount of the starter, it stays healthy for much longer or endlessly. And you might be wondering, how do you know that you have 110 grams left in your jar? Because if you weigh the jar, it's obviously also going to have the weight of the actual jar registering on the scale. For that, what I did before beginning the starter was I weighed the empty jar, and I wrote down the weight on a little piece of masking tape and taped it to the jar. That way I know exactly how much the jar weighs, and when I'm discarding the starter, I need the total weight of the jar with the starter to be the weight of the jar plus 110 grams of starter. And in my case, that's 529 grams. So I'm just gonna discard enough starters so that my jar ends up weighing 529 grams. And the discard is called discard, but you don't actually have to throw it away. There's a ton of different things that you can do with the starter. You can add it to all kinds of baked goods. I have a banana bread recipe and a chocolate chip cookie recipe that I've written up, and I'll link them below. And I'll also show you a really easy thing to do with the starter without having to bake anything right after I finish the feeding. So now my jar has 110 grams of starter remaining. I'm gonna set my discard aside. I feed the starter either all-purpose flour or spelt flour. Today I'm gonna do spelt flour. You can basically feed your starter with any flour that has gluten in it. And so I'm gonna tare my scale to 0, and I keep the amounts really simple. So I have 110 grams of starter, and I'm gonna add 110 grams of flour and the same amount of water. Now I'm gonna tare my scale again to 0 and add 110 grams of water. I'm gonna mix it all up, making sure to incorporate the starter from the bottom of the jar, and that's it. We've fed our starter, and at this point the starter will look like a thick paste, and I'm just gonna loosely cover it with the lid. I don't screw the lid all the way on, and let it sit until tomorrow morning. And another piece of tape that I have on the jar marks where the starter level is initially, and I'm looking for the starter to about double in size, so this mark is really useful for that visual. And by tomorrow morning it should be really bubbly and happy, and it will have a really nice fermented kind of sour scent to it. So I'm gonna set it aside and let it do its thing. Then we're gonna make a quick little herb pancake with the sourdough discard. So I'm getting my cast iron skillet out and I'm gonna set it to medium heat. And here's my discard. I like to thin it out a little bit to make it more the consistency of like a pancake batter. So I add a little water and I add a pinch of salt. You can add all kinds of things to it. Herbs are really nice in there. Maybe I'll add some herbs. So I've got some scallions, and I actually saw somebody make a scallion pancake like this on YouTube out of sourdough discard, so was not my idea. But you can add all kinds of herbs. It doesn't have to be scallions. Any herbs you have, rosemary would be really good, thyme. Let's do 2 scallions. And I'm gonna mix it up. I'm gonna add some olive oil to my skillet and add the batter. And I'm gonna just let it fry like a pancake. I'm gonna let the top bubble and become kind of matte and dry, and then flip it and fry the other side. Then slice it up, and it makes a great snack or like a bread component to a meal. So we often will have it with our dinner. And that's a really good and easy way to use up your discard. So next time I'll see you will be tomorrow morning when I'll be making the bread dough. The next day, my starter is nice and bubbly and risen, and I'm ready to mix my dough. So I have a large bowl. I really like working with a large bowl and my scale, and I'm gonna put the bowl on the scale and tare it to 0. So I think that the recipe that I use is the 13 Bakery Country Loaf, or it's somewhere really close to that. And I used to completely go by the 13 Bakery Country Loaf method, but over the years I've simplified it quite a bit and did away with some of the steps that I didn't find like were necessary for me. But that recipe and that book, the 13 book, is so good for learning sourdough. It's a beautiful book and it teaches you a ton, and that's basically how I learned. And another important note is that I only make 1 loaf usually, but a lot of people double the recipe and make 2 loaves of bread at the same time, just because this is such a process and people find it helpful to get more out of this 2-day process. So if you have a large family, or if you want to give away a loaf of bread to someone, or if you want to freeze some of the bread, I would say double this recipe and make 2 loaves of bread. For us, we're just 2 people, so I find that it takes us a little while to go through a whole loaf of bread, and I don't want to freeze a second one or anything like that. And I really enjoy the process, so I don't mind making it again later in the week if I need to. So the only time that I would ever double the recipe would be if I want to make it for a friend or family or something like that. Okay, so we're gonna start with water, and it's winter right now, so I like to start with lukewarm water, which is just gonna help the starter get going. When it's summer, I usually don't heat up the water at all, and if you are heating up the water, be very careful, feel it with your hand. It should just be lukewarm. It shouldn't be too hot because that could kill some of the starter, which we don't want. So I'm gonna start with 350 grams of water and 125 grams of my starter. It's so bubbly and alive right now. And when you're adding your starter, in the very beginning when you add just a little bit, a good test to see if the starter is ready is if it floats. So this is called the float test, which means that it's just so aerated and bubbly that it's ready to go. The float test doesn't always work. I've heard that if you have a starter that's made with heavy flour, like a rye flour, then the starter doesn't always necessarily float. But if you're using all-purpose flour for your starter, then this is a pretty reliable test. Once I have the right amount of starter, I stir it into the water to dissolve it. Then onto the flour, I'm gonna add 450 grams of all-purpose flour, or you can also use bread flour. And then 50 grams of whole wheat flour, or I've been using spelt flour lately just because I have some. And now I'm gonna mix it all together. I usually start out mixing with a spoon because I find it easier. And then once everything comes together into a shaggy dough, I go in with my hand. And with my hand I do these kind of fast circular motions, just making sure that all the flour is incorporated. And then once the dough is mixed, I try to get as much as I can off of my fingers and back into the bowl. And at this point, the dough will feel very shaggy and sticky and wet, but it will transform quite a bit throughout this entire process. Now we want to let the flour hydrate, so we're going to let it sit. I happen to have this glass lid from a pot that fits perfectly into this bowl, and then I also cover it with a towel. If you don't have a lid that fits, you can use a large plate or just a towel. I'm gonna set the dough aside, and now usually, since I have the scale and the flour already out, I feed my starter. I feed it just like I fed it yesterday, and then I let it sit out of the fridge until it starts rising, and I see it rising above my line that I marked. And then once I see that it starts rising, I put it in the fridge and I leave it there until I want to bake bread again. If I don't bake any bread within a week or so, then I feed the starter about once a week, but I usually end up baking bread at least once a week. So I'm gonna feed this and I'll see you in 30 minutes. It's been 30 minutes. And even after that short amount of time, you'll see that the dough looks much more hydrated, much less shaggy. I'm gonna add salt now, and I'm gonna add 9 grams, as well as 25 grams of water, and that's just gonna help us incorporate the salt into the dough. Now I'm gonna mix the salt in. This is a really fun part. You kind of dimple the dough with your fingers to get the salt in. And you'll see that the dough is not really sticking to your fingers as much anymore. And once you do that, just start kneading it. Once that's done, we're gonna let this sit for another 30 minutes. And this is when the process that's called bulk fermentation starts. So I'm gonna cover the bowl and I'll see you in another 30 minutes. 30 more minutes have passed and the dough looks even more smooth. And this is when I start doing my stretch and folds. And stretch and folds are exactly what they sound like. It's where you stretch the dough and fold it. This process is an alternative to kneading the dough. This is when the dough develops its structure and develops the gluten and basically develops enough strength to be shaped into a loaf. To do the stretch and folds, I wet my hands just so the dough doesn't stick to my hands. And I go in and kind of get one side of the dough under my hands and stretch it out, just like this. Then I turn the dough so that I can do the opposite side, and I stretch that out and fold it over, and then I do the other 2 sides. And then I flip the dough over. Then I cover the dough and let it sit for another 30 minutes. And I usually do a total of 4 to 6 stretch and folds like this before I start shaping the dough. And this is what's called bulk fermentation. During this time, you're gonna see the dough change quite a bit. It's gonna go from kind of slack and weak to strong and structured. It's gonna grow in size. It's gonna get some bubbles on it. It's actually really fun to see it transform like that. It's a beautiful process. This takes a while, but it's not much hands-on time at all. So my strategy is I just do the stretch and folds, I cover the dough, set the timer to 30 minutes, and then once the timer goes off, I come back and do it again. And I keep a little tally of how many stretch and folds I've done, just to help me remember. The dough is ready for the next step when it's grown in size by at least 30%. It's strong and it's holding its structure, and likely it's got some bubbles on the surface. The step also depends on the temperature of your kitchen. So right now it's winter, so the dough takes a little bit longer than it would in the spring or summer. And usually in the winter I have to give it all of the 6 stretch and folds for it to develop. Sometimes in the summer or whenever it's warmer, it only needs 4 stretch and folds, so it really depends. And this feeling for the dough comes from experience. It comes from doing it a bunch of times, and the only way you can develop this experience or a baker's intuition is by just doing it. And you don't want to over ferment the dough in this step, so you don't want to let it go too long, because then you'll notice that it'll start getting slack and it will start losing its shape and its structure, and it will be really hard to shape after that. I'm going to keep doing my stretch and folds every 30 minutes, probably 6 times today, and I'll see you once the dough is ready for the next step. 6 stretch and folds later, the dough is looking great. It's looking really aerated, really bouncy, jiggly, bubbly, very smooth and very strong. It's holding its shape. And now I'm ready to shape the dough and put it away in the fridge for its final rise overnight. Shaping was the thing that I had the hardest time with when learning to make sourdough. One of the reasons is that I was doing the shaping method from the Tartine cookbook. And while very effective, I think that that method is for more experienced bakers. It's much more quick and light-handed. But then later on, I learned the shaping method that I'll be doing today. And it's much more forgiving, and it makes it much easier to build tension in the dough so that it gets really nice oven spring. The other reason that I was having trouble with shaping in the beginning, I think, was because my starter was too young and not strong enough. And I think the dough kept turning out kind of slack, and I kept getting these flat loaves. For the final rise, you need something for your bread to sit inside, some kind of vessel. So this is a banneton, which is like a special bread rising basket with these ridges. I already floured this banneton. It needs to be floured really well so that the dough doesn't stick to it. Some people line their bannetons with linen and then flour that, so that's up to you. If you don't have a banneton, you can totally also use a bowl of a similar size, lined with a towel and then floured. For flouring your banneton and your bread in general, I really recommend using rice flour. It's got great non-stick properties. It really allows your bread to not stick to the banneton and to anything else that it's in. I haven't had any rice flour in a while. I just keep forgetting to get some, and I've been flouring my banneton with regular flour, and while that works, the dough definitely sticks to the banneton much more. I have my work surface where I'll be shaping the dough, and I cleaned it off. I usually wipe it down with my cleaning solution and dry it off nicely so that it's ready to go. So we are gonna have one side of the working surface be floured, and the other side of the working surface needs to not have any flour. I'm gonna flour my half of the working surface. And I usually flour pretty generously, and if you're a beginner, I would recommend flouring kind of generously. You don't want the dough to stick. It's better that you use more flour than not enough flour here. Using wet hands, I'm gonna transfer my dough to the floured surface. I'm gonna put the bowl away. And here I'm gonna stretch the dough out into a rectangle kind of shape. I'm then gonna fold the bottom of the dough over about halfway and fold the top of the dough over that. And now I'm gonna have this long kind of shape like this. So I turned it towards myself, and now I'm gonna start rolling it up. And this is all being done to build tension in the dough. So I'm rolling it up, and then I'm putting the bottom of the dough over onto the non-floured surface. And now I'm gonna work the dough to build more tension in it by pushing it away and then pulling it towards myself, pushing it away and pulling it towards myself, and doing it in a kind of circular motion. You'll see that the dough gets more tight and taut as you do this. You don't wanna do this too much. So once it's feeling nice and taut and bouncy, you're good to go. I have my banneton here. I'm gonna take the dough and flip it over and put it into the banneton, the top side down. And then in here, you can cross the dough over each other to do what's called stitches, just to seal the bottom a little bit more. This is an optional step. And that's it, the dough's done and it's ready to go into the fridge for its final rise. For the fridge, I wrapped the dough up into a couple of napkins, or kitchen towels I should say. As far as I understand, while the dough sits in the fridge, it's developing most of its sourdough flavor, so that's where sourdough gets its characteristic kind of tangy sour flavor. Different people do different things for the final rise, and the timing of the final rise varies for different bakers. I like to have my dough in the fridge for 18 hours. It works out really well with my schedule, so right now it's around 4 p.m. and that's usually around the time when I'm done with the dough if I get it started in the morning. So that means that I can bake it 18 hours later at around 10 a.m. and then the bread will be ready for lunch. So that works out really well. I know that some people prefer shorter fridge time, others prefer a longer fridge time, but basically the longer your dough sits in the fridge, the more it will ferment. It will just ferment much slower than it would at room temperature because of the cooler temperature in the fridge, but it is still fermenting and it's getting more and more sour. I've heard of people keeping it in the fridge for up to 24 hours, so it really depends, but I find that 18 hours is a really sweet spot. So I'm gonna go ahead and tuck this away in the fridge. And I'll see you tomorrow morning for the most exciting part, which is baking the bread. Good morning. It's bread day. It's a really cold day today, which is perfect for baking bread and having fresh bread in the house. It's gonna be so cozy. No matter how many times I bake bread, I'm always so incredibly excited on baking day. It's just such a gift and such a treat. I use a Dutch oven for baking my bread. The bread is baked with the lid on for about the first half of the process, and that creates a really nice steamy environment inside the Dutch oven, which helps the bread rise and does all kinds of other scientific stuff that I don't really remember. So an oven that you would see in an actual bread bakery creates a steamy environment within it, but our regular ovens don't do that, and that's why a Dutch oven is super useful. If you don't have a Dutch oven, there are ways to bake bread without it. I think you put like a dish of water into the oven with your bread so that the water evaporates and creates steam. I've never done it, so I can't recommend different methods, but if you search baking bread without a Dutch oven, you will find plenty of tips. The very first step to baking the bread is preheating the oven and preheating the Dutch oven along with it. So I'm gonna preheat the oven to 500 Fahrenheit. We're starting with a nice high temperature. And I'm gonna put my Dutch oven in there and let it stay in there while the oven preheats. Okay, so the oven is preheated and I've gathered all of my supplies here for baking. So I've got the dough here, which is nice and domed on the top. Very good sign, because it means that it rose even more in the fridge, but not too much. I have a piece of parchment paper for flipping the dough and for transferring it into the Dutch oven. I'll use it as a sling. And then I have a plate also for flipping the dough. I have a cork pad for putting the Dutch oven on so that I don't burn my counter with the hot Dutch oven. I have a razor blade, one of these just basic razor blades for scoring the bread. And scoring the bread is important because it allows it to rise in a very controlled and uniform way. If you were not to score the bread, it would still rise, but it would randomly burst in different areas, and that might affect the shape of the bread and the oven spring, and it just won't look as nice. And finally, I have a little cup of water here. I add a splash of water to the Dutch oven just to create even more steam, and that steam helps the crust on the final loaf be crispier. So we're ready. So I'm gonna put the parchment paper on my bread, and I'm gonna put the plate on here as well for flipping. Next, I'm gonna get the Dutch oven out and be very careful because it's piping hot at this point. I usually take it out and I leave the lid on the stovetop because I don't need it over there. And I transfer the Dutch oven here. Now I'm gonna go ahead and flip the bread. So I literally just flip the plate. Makes it really easy. And here I can already feel that the dough stuck to the banneton because I wasn't using rice flour like I was saying. I really recommend using rice flour, but it's not a big deal. I just let gravity do its thing and the dough will eventually come out. I kind of smooth out the flour from the banneton, and scoring is next. So I use my razor blade. You can also use a sharp knife, but I find that the razor blade works better. So I do a square cut, which is very typical for a round loaf of bread. It works really well, and I do a little decorative design in the middle of the square. The decorative design should be a very shallow cut, shouldn't be too deep. So I'm doing like a little flower in the middle, kind of like a tulip. And then the square cut, the functional cut for rising the bread, should be pretty deep. I learned in the tartine book that you should hold the razor blade at a kind of an angle, so not straight down, and I cut a square. Next, I transfer the dough using the sling into the Dutch oven. I add a little splash of water in, put the lid on, and into the oven. I bake the dough covered with the lid for the first 20 minutes, and then I take the lid off and finish baking it for another 30. In terms of temperature, every oven is different. For me, for the first 15 minutes, I keep the temperature at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and then at the last 5 minutes of the 20-minute baking time, I lower the temperature to 375. Bake it for another 5 minutes, take the lid off, and keep baking at 375 for the remaining 30 minutes. And this knowledge came from playing around with my oven and seeing how hot I can bake the bread before the bottom is too burnt. These times and temperatures are just ones that I found to be the best. I think the general guidance for sourdough is that you preheat the Dutch oven at 500 and then bake at 450, or bake for just a little bit at 500 and then lower the temperature to 450. I find that that's too low for my oven. I find that the bread doesn't color well enough, so that's why I've been baking at a higher temperature. But we'll check in next when I'm taking off the lid. And that's a really exciting moment because we get to see if the bread rose and how it shaped up. Okay, 20 minutes later, and I'm gonna take off the lid. Bread is looking good, but you'll see that it's still very pale, so that's why it needs that extra 30 minutes without the lid. So we'll see the final result in 30 minutes. Okay, the bread is done. Let's take it out. I'm gonna very carefully get it out of the Dutch oven and slide the parchment paper out. Parchment paper can be reused a few times until it gets too brittle and then it starts breaking. So be careful, don't reuse it too many times because it might break on you. And here's our bread. It's looking very nice. I think I might have made the square cut a little too small. I prefer it a little bit bigger, but it's colored up nicely and it rose nicely, and I can't wait to try it. Now comes probably the hardest part of the process, which is waiting for the bread to cool. I usually let it cool for 1 to 2 hours, and this is a really crucial step because the bread is still cooking, and if you cut into it while it's hot like this, it will still be delicious, but you might risk the bread being gummy. But in about an hour or so, when I cut this bread for lunch, I'll show you the shot of the crumb and what it looks like inside. And I'll link my recipe for this bread with all of my tips down below, as well as some other resources that I find helpful and some tools. I hope you enjoyed this video. I wish you lots of success with your sourdough, whatever recipe you use. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.